It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me today, Conservative peer Ed Vaizey, Labour MP Stella Creasy, Miata Fanbule from the New Economics Foundation and the Daily Telegraph's Christopher Hope. Today, will the Chancellor's mini-budget really make a difference to the cost of living?
The plan we announced yesterday will put billions of pounds back in the pockets of hard-working British families.
At the end of this Parliament, 7 out of 8 workers are going to be paying more in taxes.
He's cut the cost of petrol at the pumps, but will that help the people who need it most? After P&O Ferries sacked 800 workers, the company's boss faces MPs.
Can I start, please, with an apology? Actually, an apology to the seafarers that were affected on Thursday last week.
1 month after the Russian invasion, President Zelensky asks people around the world to protest.
Come to your squares, your streets, make yourselves visible and heard. Say that people matter, freedom matters, peace matters, Ukraine matters.
Will the world leaders meeting in Brussels listen to him? In Jamaica, William and Kate hear calls that the UK should pay reparations for slavery.
I want to express my profound sorrow. Slavery was abhorrent, and it should never have happened.
Let's pick up on Prince William's comments. The Cambridges arrived on a week-long tour of the Caribbean. They've been in Jamaica. They were met with some protests and also calls for the UK government to pay reparations. That's my question to the panel to start the programme. Should the UK government pay reparations, Ed Vaizey?
Well, I don't think we should pay reparations per se. I think reparations is a metaphor, if you like, for social justice. I mean, if you go down the rabbit hole of how you pay reparations, it's extremely complicated, potentially very expensive. Who do you pay reparations to? But if you think that there is an issue with equality in this country, then I would agree with that. And we need to lean into it and make a difference, and that's what we should be focusing our energies on.
Right. What about you, Stella? I mean, Prince William expressed his profound sorrow for the appalling atrocity of slavery. The Culture Minister in Jamaica has confirmed that Jamaica is seeking reparations. Should they be paid?
Yeah, look, I think there's definitely a conversation to be had, and I think we should take our lead from the royal family, who are actually saying we should be having this conversation and do recognise that there is an issue there. I do agree with Ed that it becomes more difficult about the practicalities of it, but I don't think we should close our minds to it. And we should recognise this isn't just about families here in the UK. This is also about the impact that we had on Jamaica. And I think it's absolutely right that rather than running away from this issue, the royal family are actually showing some leadership and talking about it. I just wish the government would do the same. Well,
talking about it is one thing. We are talking about a proposed package. This was from one Jamaican MP of £7.6 billion.
Yeah, and I think this is a reflection of the kinds of issues we're talking about and the kind of impact that slavery had. But we can't run away from our history. We can't pretend it didn't happen like the government report tried to do. We actually have to confront it head on. And as part of that, have the conversation about what we do to put it right. Now, you know, the royals are in listening mode, and the government should be as well.
Miata?
Yes, so I think it's good that there was an apology, and actually that's been one of the issues. There hasn't been an official public apology for the historical blight of slavery. And I think the truth that there is a debt that is owed because, 12 million Africans were enslaved, and it's not just to Jamaica, it's the Caribbean, it's African. I think that debt is real. And for me, I think that is the framing by which we should think about things like international development. I don't think we should see it as, a handout that we give at our whim. It is part of that historical obligation. And we should therefore say there is a level at which countries that have advanced off the back of other countries and advanced by exploiting other countries make the contribution in order to level the field.
I mean, it's interesting the words that we use. He actually said he felt sorrow. There have been reports it's not quite the same as saying sorry, because that that might in some way then directly link to some sort of compensation or reparations being paid. Should they pay, the UK government?
Well, £7 billion that Stella mentioned is half the aid budget, and isn't how you're describing there maybe as a way of seeing that as some form of, I mean, nowhere near recompense may be required. What's interesting, of course, is the only money paid out by the government in this area has been to slave owners who lost their lands in 1832. Around 20 million was paid out to 40,000 owners, and the bond to pay that money back only stopped being paid back by the government in 2015. It's a very real number, quite a modern number actually, and the money's gone one way to slave owners, of course, we know about that, and should anything happen the other way. But where, as Ed says, where do you draw the line? Do you say, well, anything that happened in the 1700s doesn't count, or the 1500s? Where do you draw the line at dreadful things being perpetrated by this country on other people? Where do you stop?
And I would agree, because, look, you can't put a price on just the atrocious human suffering and the exploitation. Of course you can't. But I do think we need to reframe that conversation about our obligation to other nations and actually see things like development aid. By the way, see the conversation about climate reparations and climate transition funds in that light. We have a historical obligation to do our bit, to pay our part, and it shouldn't be at our whim. And, I should think it shouldn't be 0.5% if we want to do it. It should be a number, and we say it is done because we owe it to you. And this is our part in order to set things right.
Well, I do. I think reframing it as part of international aid and part of our obligations to other countries where we have this kind of history. But I'm interested to hear what Christopher says in terms of the worldview of the Daily Telegraph. I mean, I think it's very refreshing that these things are acknowledged. I think it's very important. We certainly shouldn't run away from our history, and we should acknowledge it. And I've been somebody who's stood up and said that this kind of anti-woke attack is absolutely ridiculous. It's not woke. It's about social justice. It's about recognising the divisions in our society. The thing about reparations, I did a lot of work, obviously, on diversity when I was the Creative Industries Minister, and I had this argument with my colleagues, which I said, if you argue, for example, for quotas, you are, in a sense, you make yourself vulnerable, because it then becomes a really nice, juicy argument about whether quotas are the right thing. And what worries me about reparations, it then becomes a nice, juicy argument for all those who don't want to do the right thing, say, well, reparations are a ridiculous idea, instead of a positive argument about how you make a difference.
So if you don't do reparations, what do you do then, Ed?
Well, we've talked about it today. We've talked about international aid. We've talked about social justice in this country.
It's one thing to say we should have the conversation. It is another thing to say that we will act. And what you're saying is, OK, this might not be the right way to act. We have an obligation not to be the ones asking those people who were damaged by this to come up with the alternative. We have to lead on it as well. And I think that's what the Royals are doing. And as I say, the government at the very least should say we'll have this conversation.
We agree with this on this, Stella.
On that note of agreement, we're going to talk about the spring statement. There may not be quite as much consensus and agreement across the board. Yesterday, following on from the special programme we had, let's have a look at some of the front pages. The Times, first of all, biggest fall in living standards since the 1950s. That was from the Office of Budget Responsibility. And The Guardian has cost of living surges and Sunak squeezes poorest. We're going to discuss those claims in some detail, but let's start with this headline. In The Telegraph, the RAC brand's 5p fuel duty cut, a drop in the ocean. We're joined by Howard Cox from Fair Fuel UK, who has been campaigning for this. It was the first time a cut happened in more than a decade. Howard, your reaction to that particular announcement from the Chancellor?
Well, hello to everyone. It would be churlish of me to criticise a 5p cut in fuel duty with the VAT. That's 6p, and it works out to an 8% cut on the levy. It's unprecedented to see that. And in normal times, I would have said jump from the rooftops and grab everyone's and give them a cuddle about the whole thing. But seriously, but in terms of 5 to 6p at the moment, when pump prices went up 20 to 30p in the last 5 to 6 weeks, it is a drop in the ocean. But having said that, what is worrying at the moment is the fuel supply chain actually not passing this on quick enough. At 6 p.m. last night, I'm getting more than anecdotal evidence to say that pump prices actually went up on the same day before the announcement by Rishi Sunak, and by something like 4 to 6p. And so when it did go down last night, there was no difference.
Right. Well, of course, that was the fear expressed yesterday, that would happen in those intervening hours. How much further would you like it to have gone?
Well, we call for 10p privately, right. But I worked very closely with Robert Halfon MP, very closely indeed, and he managed to get 53 Tory MPs to write to the top man Boris and hopefully Boris, and they call for 5p cut in fuel duty. 10p would have been logical. But when you compare oil prices similar levels as they are now, between $110 and $121, I think it's 121 today, and compared to when those prices of oil were at the same time in the last 8 or 9 years, pump prices, even with exchange rates in sterling, pump prices were actually 10 to 15p cheaper. So there is some profiteering going up in the fuel supply chain, and that's why we want a body called Pump Watch.
Right. Well, would you like it to be made permanent, this cut? It's in place until next March.
It's a great question. I mean, it'll be over my dead body if it goes up. I'm going to be fighting like mad to make sure it's kept at the level it is now and even go down even further. So, yes, in answer to your question, and that was a good thing that Rishi did, actually, because in Ireland, for example, it's gone down 17p for petrol and 12p for diesel, but it's only for 6 months. So I must give congratulations to Rishi Sunak to actually, keep it for 1 year in the cycle into next year's statement.
Right. Should it be made permanent, Ed?
Well, I think Howard mentioned Robert Halfon. Robert Halfon is effectively, with Howard...
The Conservative MP's been campaigning.
The Conservative MP introduced a fuel duty cut for the last decade or so. He persuaded David Cameron not to put petrol onto the fuel duty escalator, which was meant to rise with inflation as a sort of green tax measure. So he's been campaigning with Howard very successfully on this. I would cut it for as long as possible. I mean, I do think that fuel costs really impact people who rely on their cars for work, and I think it's a very real... impact on the cost of living. So whether it should last beyond the year, let's see what things look like in a year. But I think it is very welcome it's happened. It's something I support. I don't think we should be diverted to say somehow it's going to turn the stop climate change action. And well done, Howard. Right.
Well, Miata, obviously you disagree because you tweeted this. I don't know if we've actually got the tweet, but I've got your words. Instead of targeting support at those under pressure, the Chancellor opted for tax cuts that don't focus help where it's needed. Only 7% of the benefits of the fuel duty cut will go to the poorest fifth households, and 33% will go to the richest fifth. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, so in the end, a lot of poor households don't have cars, and a lot of poor households don't use cars. It tends to be a lot of fuel is consumed by richer households. So, in effect, it is a policy measure that not only doesn't actually do that much because the cut is basically offset by the rises that are happening in petrol prices anyway, but for those that actually need the help, it's not particularly targeted. It doesn't really help them. It's like £1.80 a month for the poorest households compared to those driving SUVs that perhaps shouldn't be driving SUVs around London.
Ed?
Well, as I say, I mean, I had this argument with Stella the last time, so I'll now have it with Miata, that I believe that I think the price of fuel is a signal about, whether the government takes seriously the kind of cost of living increases that are hitting hard-working families, to coin a phrase that government ministers do love to use. There are lots of other things we can talk about, like energy prices as well, which I'm very frightened by, the massive increase in energy prices, which will obviously hit the poorer households, where I think the government could and should do more. But I certainly think this is, whether it's £1.80 a week or not, it's a signal the government is taking this issue seriously, and they should continue to monitor it. And Robert Halfon's campaign has, as I say, has been very, very successful over more than a decade in recognising that this has a big impact on people's household incomes.
I would argue that the government needs to do less signalling and actually get on with helping with the cost of living crisis. Yeah. And actually the thing that's biting is energy. So he could have, not to parrot Labour's policy, but he could have put a windfall tax on energy producers and energy generators and used that in order to bear down on the cost of energy bills. That would have been an actual substantial measure that would have made an impact. And he didn't do that. So don't signal on a policy that actually doesn't bite and actually doesn't help the poorest.
I think the policy does bite. I think Howard Cox does not live in a vacuum. He talks to people all the time about the massive impact fuel prices have on
let's ask Howard. I mean, listening to the debate here in the studio, Howard, I mean, is this cut fair if it doesn't help those that need it most?
I have a lot of sympathy with Stella and what she said, but there's one thing she missed. Sorry?
Miata, who was talking before.
Oh, I apologise, because I can't see who's speaking.
No, I know you can't. It's very difficult.
It is. Anyway, but seriously, the point is we're talking about a tax that actually impacts on inflation, impacts on all our lives. Everything in your studio, everything you in your home arrived on a truck, a diesel truck. We're the only country in the world that has diesel higher priced than petrol, for example. I'm backed by the Road Haulage Association, the brilliant Road Haulage Association, and I got a phone call yesterday from a trucking haulage company with about 25 trucks, and he thanked me quite emotionally. He said, "Thank you for this. My company's staying viable for another 2 to 3 months because of this 5p cut in duty."
Yeah.
The impact on inflation and what we buy in the shops will affect everyone. It's not just the rich.
Yeah, it's a very good point about, supermarket trucks delivering to your local supermarket are going to benefit from this.
This is the challenge, isn't it? Is that actually yesterday the Chancellor spent a lot of time signalling and not a lot of time actually acting on the things that really will make sure there's more money in people's pockets.
But Stella, do you appreciate what Howard's just said there?
Well, let me come to it, because look, Howard is right about the distribution chains. I think there is a challenge for us as a country that we seem to go from crisis to crisis to crisis. And actually, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves is there a better way of doing distribution that means that those raw hauliers are not at the behest of the diesel companies in the way that he's talking about? The argument we had the other week was about childcare costs, and the Chancellor, 3,500 words in that statement yesterday, not a single word on children or childcare costs. And yet for many families in this country, that is absolutely critical. If you want to put a 1-year-old in a nursery full-time so you can go to work and earn the money and pay your taxes, that's 14 grand a year. Even with the subsidies that the government is putting in, you're still talking about an extra £1,000 a week for older children. And so looking at what actually most families, most hard-working families and wannabe hard-working families are spending money on, it is right to ask the question whether an extra 29 quid a year in terms of your fuel bill versus maybe something more substantial on childcare or energy would have hit the spot. As it is, inflation is going to wipe out all of these changes, including for those raw hauliers.
Well, Howard, before we let you go, one of the things that Ed Vaizey mentioned was that it wouldn't deter the government from meeting its climate commitments. But should we really be cutting fuel duty, given that we have this climate change crisis, as many people see it?
I was wondering where I was going to be asked that one.
Well, there you go. I haven't disappointed you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. The simple thing is, this is not the time to talk about the environment. People have no choice but to use their vehicle to go to work, to go, to deliver their children to school, to go to medical appointments, our deliveries, etc. A cut in 5p or an increase in 5p would have made no difference into road usage at the moment in time. We should be focusing on actually incentivising people to move to cleaner fuels and working with them closely. But at the moment, it's the cost of living crisis that matters.
Right, Miata, you raised your eyebrows then.
I did, because I think that this is a genuine risk that we say, let's park climate, let's park the fact that we've got this existential threat because we're dealing with it here and now. I think you've got to do both together. I think if we don't, we go from crisis to crisis. And in 10 years' time, when we didn't act because we were dealing with the cost of living crisis, and suddenly the impact on climate starts to bite people, and that will have a cost of living impact as well, we will absolutely kick ourselves. So we've got to do...
Together.
Absolutely. So we've got to do both together.
Let's work together. Every single driver wants to breathe clean air. Everyone wants to do that. We shouldn't be demonised for the fact that we have to get in our car, our diesel car, to go to work. And we need to work together and work on things that we all share and get a good road user strategy that's actually good for the environment. I will work with anyone to do that.
Right, demonising motorists, is that what's happening?
No, I don't think so. Look, and the point about how do we incentivise, where is the package, for example, to allow people to move on to electric cars, I think is a legitimate one. So, of course, we've got to do this. But I think we've got to hold the cost of living crisis, which is real and now, alongside climate, because otherwise we ignore one crisis in order to focus on another.
I agree it's not an either-or, but we are world leaders in terms of climate change policies. I mean, we have more offshore wind farms, that sounds slightly bizarre stat, more offshore wind farms than any other country in the world. We've created a massive offshore wind farm industry in this country. We use much more renewables. We've virtually eliminated coal. There are lots of things where we've made progress. So let's not demonise the car driver when the UK is doing so well in terms of climate change policies.
It's not where the politics is right now. I mean, this cost of living crisis is what matters.
Well,
and this transitional fuel and rest.
Well, let's talk about it.
Chris, you can say that, and then the Chancellor made a point yesterday of trying to incentivise people getting heat pumps and solar panels, not in any way that would actually really make an impact on the market as they did in 2010, but only those people with savings. So the wealthier people in our country will be able to take advantage of that. So actually, this is where the government thinks the politics are, but just myopically, only for those people who can afford it.
We're going to say
the majority of people aren't.
Well, we're going to talk about all of these issues now in a
topic,
bigger.
Joe. We don't want to move on.
No, well, we're not going to move on, but I have to say goodbye to Howard. I am only, being polite. Once. Howard, thank you very much for joining us. And Chris, I want to start with you when we talk more broadly about the Spring Statement itself. plenty of critics saying that the Chancellor tinkered with the tax system, offered some giveaways, but it was a mask for a more broad cost of living squeeze, and not enough was done for households and businesses. How's it been received?
Well, there are two audiences. I was in the House of Commons last night trying to find out what Tory MPs thought, and they all thought it went rather well. Rishi Sunak left the 1922 committee meeting, where they all meet the MPs.
Yes, he had to talk to them, didn't he?
Was that before his phone? He was a ray of sunshine, like the weather outside, Joe. And then you read the front pages of today's papers, including the Telegraph, saying the biggest fall in living standards on record. These headlines are taken mainly from the OBR, the forecast alongside the Blue Book, is now called this Blue Book of tax raising. So, normally you get a day of relief. You might get a headline on the increase in thresholds on NICs. You might get these 1p off income tax in 2 years' time. That's all been pushed to one side by the horrors of what people are facing over the next 6 months. And he said this morning, didn't he, Rishi Sunak, I can't fix everything.
Right.
And I thought that was so interesting. He's suddenly, the sheen has gone, and it reminds me why so few chancellors become Prime Minister, because at the end of the day, they just get whacked. I mean, I know Gordon Brown, you're about to say it, Stella, but I should add successful Prime Minister because he didn't win an election. I mean, that's the point. And John Major for a few months and then became Prime Minister. But generally, it's the death knell of a lot of careers being Chancellor.
Right. I mean, it's interesting, Stella, those words, because you will remember during the pandemic, he said, we'll do whatever it takes, is what Rishi Sunak said. And yesterday, and perhaps the day before, he was saying, we will stand by people during this difficult time. Those two headline announcements of the cut to the basic rate of income tax by 1 pence by 2024, we now know that will probably be when the general election is, and increasing the threshold of national insurance contributions by £3,000. Will it make any difference to the cost of living crisis?
I just think that's the challenge with this, is it just came across that the Chancellor doesn't really understand the scale of the problem that we're facing, or where, in fact, if you are going to put money in, it could make the biggest bang for your buck, which is what you want to do. You want to invest in tackling those problems. So you think it will make some difference, just not enough? I just think it's scraping the sides of a very big challenge, as we've all said, and it's independent organisations pointing out that for every pound he might give you back, he's still taking 6 away from you. So fundamentally, people are going to be paying more taxes. He has given more money to the richest families in this country than the poorest families, where actually that makes the biggest marginal impact on some of the challenges that we face, both in terms of having to intervene, whether it's increased benefits or lower tax takes. And actually, that is incredibly short-sighted. Well, and that's the challenge. And also, as I said earlier, he's missed out on some massive bills that people face, whether it is childcare or energy. Right. And those are the things that people are looking at now. Yeah. They're looking at the fact that the costs are going up and going, well, what's he doing for that?
Well, there is a short-term, an immediate term and a slightly longer term. It's interesting that the Institute of Fiscal Studies, they were here on the programme yesterday, said as a fraction of income, gains from the measures are highest at the bottom and gradually fall with income. That is the definition of a progressive set of measures. What do you say in response to that, Miata?
Well, so I think there are two things. I think let's take his tax measures. The income tax thing is a nonsense. Why are you talking about a tax change in 2024 when the cost of living is biting now and it's not going to have any impact on anyone?
Well, that's a political calculation.
It's political, but I think it's tone deaf, and for people out there, it will just feel actually very, very hollow. You take the national insurance threshold rise, and it will benefit 70% of people, but the 30% of people it won't benefit are those that desperately need help, those that are on the edge, those that are on low pay, and he did nothing. I mean, I'm literally reeling from this. He did absolutely nothing for people who are literally on the edge of making that choice between eating and heating their homes, feeding their kids. Nothing in that budget. And if even the NI change, the bottom 10%, they gain £60 a year from it. A household of 2 people, £60. The top 10% gains £500 from that change. So, yes, it will help people, but the people he needed to help, the people, quite frankly, it's a disgrace that we've left to languish. He did nothing in this budget, and I think that's unforgivable. Do
you think you'll have to come back later in the year? We're expecting another increase in the energy price cap, already having one. It's pretty substantial, £700 to those default tariffs. Will you have to come back to help out, do you think, Ed Vaizey, those people on benefits, because they're only being increased in line with 3.1% and inflation is going to average out at 7.4%?
Well, look, I think Mieta's been very unfair on Rishi Sunak. He provided an enormous amount of support during the pandemic and the coronavirus crisis, and I think he should be congratulated for that. That was a significant achievement. And as people have pointed out, despite the critical press, you don't want to be Chancellor at a time like this when you're just coming through the pandemic and you've now got the uncertainty of the terrible war in Ukraine. But I think you're absolutely right, Jo. This spring statement felt like someone who was keeping stuff in reserve, because I think if this Chancellor has learnt anything, and he's a very able Chancellor, it's events, dear boy, events, to coin a phrase, come at you fast at the moment, and who knows where we might be in 3 months' time and what firepower he might need to deploy.
Well, that's so is he holding? I mean, is he holding back then to come back with more?
I think he panicked last September with the 1.25% increase in NICs, and he's given Labour a massive benefit for the next election when you will say, with reason and correctly, you can't trust the Tories on tax because they broke page 2 of their manifesto pledge not to increase NICs, and they had headroom this time to reverse it. Yeah. He didn't do it. The long-term memory that the mistake made yesterday was not to reverse that increase.
Well, it'd be very interesting, because I think he should have reversed the increase, but I can imagine the conversations in Number 10 saying, you've got no room for manoeuvre. You've got out on a limb to say this money is essential to save the health service. So the Labour Party wouldn't have turned around and said, oh, look, they've been forced to renege on their broken promise. They would have said, you're letting down the NHS. Right, and your colleague on Newsnight, Miata, last night said that tackling a cost of living crisis through tax cuts is like throwing a bucket of water over someone thirsty. Explain that analogy.
Well, I think it's a brilliant analogy.
Have you all got water?
Yeah.
You do it now.
No, it's a brilliant analogy because, in effect, it's saying it is really inefficient, so that £500 that's going to the top 10%, and it's not actually helping those that need it. So it's a measure that is an expansive measure in some respects, but it doesn't target the help where you needed it. And he could have done that. The sort of £6 billion that he's put on that threshold, he could have used that to reverse the £20 uplift. That would have meant that the bottom household, £1,000 a year that they need to cushion this fall. It's about the choices that he made that, in the end, I think it will come back to bite him, because I don't understand the justification for when you're being told by, food banks that we are seeing something absolutely catastrophic in this country. You would make the political choice not to act.
We also need to be really clear that poverty is really expensive. So when you invest in people in the lowest incomes, they spend that money. The money that you're talking about, that extra £500, is going to prop up people's savings. It's not going to go back into the economy. And so actually one of the real challenges we face, not just that we should have chopped the national insurance rise, it's that what is going to help our economy grow again to get us out of the challenges that we're in. Well, and time again, this Chancellor is making short-term choices, a bit like the Prime Minister, about what looks good on the headlines. So as you say, you're obsessed with the headlines. But longer term, if you've got people starving, that is money they're not spending on food, which means that they are needing help and support. That costs us double.
Well, hang on. But Labour have said and criticised Rishi Sunak endlessly for being a tax-raising Chancellor. Are tax cuts pointless?
No, of course not. But there's a time and place for them. And there's also a question about what are the challenges? What are causing the cost of living crisis?
Well, let's have a look at that.
Because energy companies, but come on, Jo, let's look at this. The energy companies are making an absolute packet at the moment. It's absolutely right to ask them to pay some money into the system to cut energy bills so that we don't have people not able to heat their homes, losing their homes. I've got a lot of residents right now. I have the 10th highest level of child poverty in the country. I've got a lot of people who cannot pay their rent. It doesn't take a maths genius to work out we're going to all end up paying for them to be in new accommodation, and they still won't be able to heat their houses.
And the people on the lowest incomes, let's say inflation does peak at around 8 or 9%. The Shadow Chancellor was being asked this morning, Rachel Reeves, about what Labour would do. Should Labour peg benefits and pensions to 8-9%?
Look, there's absolutely, as Miata said, there is a political choice that was made about the national insurance rise or the benefits rise. I think there are different choices that could have been made.
But should they? I mean, if they, quite rightly, in many people's minds, you should be helping those in most need. Inflation is going to be soaring, and clearly benefits are not going to be increased at the same rate. But should Labour commit to that? If you really are on the side of those families, should Labour say, yes, we'll peg benefits to 7%?
We've already said on universal credit we would fundamentally change the system and change what people are being paid, because it isn't working right now. We are going to end up paying more. So that is part of the conversation. Look, what you're asking me is about what the numbers will be.
Well, the numbers are important. But the numbers are important because 3.1%, as we know, is less
I am going to keep
than half of 7.
I'm going to keep banging the drum for investing in childcare, because it is about getting more people back to
work.
It is
it's an understandable luxury of being in opposition that you can criticise the government, but the government, the Chancellor, has to make choices. Some of those choices will be popular and some will be unpopular. I wasn't particularly keen on this 1 pence drop in income tax. It seemed to be utterly pointless tax cut, and one in the future which perhaps signals when the next election will be. What it feels like, though, at the moment is, as I say, may sound odd, that Rishi Sunak is a sort of holding pattern, because this is unprecedented times and we do not know what is coming down the road. What is missing, but it seems almost impossible to fill, is a kind of clear long-term narrative of what you do about the economy, because it's impossible at this stage to work out what the economy is going to look like in 6 months or a year time.
Out of work.
I think we should hear from some of the other members of the panel.
Chris.
Well, I was going to ask Ed if he thought a windfall tax on oil companies might be white work. It was raised. Howard Cox just said there how ahead of the cut in fuel duty, they actually increased the forecourt price to bring it down to what it was anyway. So
it's very interesting. I mean, I'm totally agnostic on it. I mean, there was a windfall tax on the banks by the Labour Party. It seems perhaps it's a gift that keeps on giving. It's certainly easy for Labour politicians to say.
Some Tory MPs
that's
in the North want it. I mean,
that's the answer to all our prayers. And it's interesting that it's not being debated on the Tory benches at all, it seems, in terms of whether or not it's effective.
Can I just point everyone to this headline in the Daily Mail? It was obviously announced, or stated, I should say, by Rishi Sunak. Paying interest on UK's debt will cost £83 billion in 1 year. Miata, we've had historically low interest rates. All this borrowing does come with costs, doesn't it?
Yeah, but I think that headline is really deceptive, because so it's 83 billion. It spikes this year, but if you look at the OBR's forecast, what we see is for every other year in this Parliament, debt interest payments is about less than 2% of GDP. You put that in historical context, on average over the last 30 years, it's been about 2.2%. So I would argue that actually it's sustainable. We are basically where we've been in the past. But critically, you look at what's happening to debt. It's going down at the fastest rate over the course of the next 5 years than we've seen for decades. So he has headroom. And I think that we've got to be really careful about the debt narrative being a justification for not acting, which for me was about a political choice, because there is headroom, not least because 40% of that debt is owned by the Bank of England, who again is a patient creditor. So we are not... That headline makes you think that we're in this sort of debt bind that means, gosh, I don't have room to manoeuvre. That is patently not true, and the OBR forecast shows that to be the case.
We're going to talk about something else. In fact, I think it happened when most of you were here on the programme last week, which was P&O, the sacking of those 800 staff. We heard from the CEO in the headlines, the CEO of P&O Ferries, Peter Hebblethwaite. He's been grilled by MPs after the action last week. Now, Prime Minister's questions yesterday, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson said it appeared that the company had broken the law. That has been questioned by some lawyers, and the government would be taking action. But let's hear Peter Hebblethwaite a little bit more, what he said to MPs.
Mr Hebblethwaite, did P&O have a duty to consult the unions in good time over the redundancies pursuant to Section 188 of the Trade Union Act of 1992?
There's absolutely no doubt that we were required to consult with the unions. We chose not to do that because we believe...
You chose to break the law?
Because we chose not to consult, and we will will compensate everybody in full for that.
Yes, well, it was quite a grilling. You heard in the headlines, Ed Vaizey, that Peter Hebblethwaite apologised to the 800 workers he sacked. What do you make of the apology?
Well, I thought it was pretty insincere. I mean, the minute I saw it on your being played out at the top of the programme, I thought, well, there's a media spin doctor who's being paid a lot of money, more than the seafarers who've been sacked, that's for sure, to tell this bloke to stand in front of the committee and humbly apologise, and it didn't look to me like he meant a word of it.
Right, Stella?
Oh, it's terrible. The point is, what are we all going to do about it? Because if one company can get away with it, others will feel they can follow. And it's extraordinary to have a chief executive just go, yes, soz about that, we thought we'd pay the fine, as it's no big deal. We can't let that lie.
Well, on that, the General Secretary of the RMT union has called for direct intervention to get workers back, those same workers, back on those ships. Is that what Labour should be calling for?
Oh, look, I think Carl Turner is absolutely right about this, who's been a doughty fighter for the workers of P&O. The issue here is that right now they don't have to pay the national minimum wage. The government could, if it wanted to, make it a condition of licensing that they have to pay the national minimum wage if they're going to dock their ships here, and we could make sure that we're not seeing workers being undercut, because that's what's happened in this instance. They've decided to sack everybody for cheaper wages, and we have a national minimum wage in this country for a reason. We have a cost-of-living crisis.
Yeah, sure, but what can we do for these workers? But what can the government do for these workers that have been sacked, these 800? Anything?
I'm short of nationalising P&O. I can't imagine that happening. I mean, you know, the problem they've got is they can't wear the levers here. I mean, Boris Johnson, to be fair to him, did, I think, raise many of these points in PMQs on Wednesday. He did talk about...
He didn't commit to changing... I mean, the thing we could do for them is to change the law to make sure that you can't sack people, to put them... This is fire and rehire.
The law isn't enough, is it? The point is...
We tried to bring in regulations to stop fire and rehire. This is exactly why, because that's what these companies have done. There is a very simple change. Carl is absolutely right. Boris should pick up the phone to him and get it sorted next week.
Is that what should happen? The law should be changed. What about the workers themselves, the ones that have lost?
Well, I mean, that's the job of this conversation, because there's a lot of horses and a lot of stable doors here, because obviously, you know, the workers have been sacked, and what do you do about that? And apparently Boris saying it was illegal is not actually the case. I mean, it's certainly, I think we would all sign up and say...
national minimum wage.
Given, well, you're right, the Conservative government has substantially increased the minimum wage over many, many years. But, you know, what are the loopholes in employment legislation that allows the company to do this? And what he basically said in front of the Select Committee was, we knew if we didn't consult, we would have to pay extra compensation. We chose to do that. We took a financial route rather than a negotiation route to get us to where we wanted to be. So those may be loopholes that need to be closed. Certainly, I didn't know the point about the seafarers potentially any ship docking at a port being paid the minimum wage. That seems a very sensible way forward. But what you do about the seafarers now is a very difficult situation. But certainly I think the government could get stuck in with the leadership of P&O to see what can happen.
I mean, Robert Courts, Transport Minister, has said the government will bring forward a package of proposals to prevent what happened at P&O happening again. Obviously, we don't know exactly what that looks like because they've yet to bring it forward. Does that reassure you, Miata?
It doesn't. But, I mean, I think this whole thing should be a massive wake-up call. And the fact that they could have done this and it is legal, I think, says all we need to know about our employment rights. I think the thing that the government can do is lean really heavily on the company, and that's a combination of legislation around, legislation that tightens up employment rights. It is about licensing and saying there is a condition, because suddenly, if you're not going to be paying £1.80 to workers from India, it might make the whole proposition look far less attractive. And actually, by the way, you don't get government contracts. You don't get...
Free ports being one.
Exactly. If you do this, and they will make that calculation themselves and they will reverse the decision. But I think you've got to put a lot of pressure on them, not least because I think you've got to set a standard and example and make an example of them so no other company thinks that this is OK, because it's not.
It's setting an example, but also closing loopholes, the ones that clearly exist.
Seems that way, doesn't it? I mean, the horse, as Ed says, has bolted on this one, and whether these workers want to go back at all to work for this company again, I'm not sure.
But that's the thing. We've all talked to them, and there is a huge family sense about working in P&O. It sends shockwaves across the whole industry. They need us both to fight for them now to make sure they get proper compensation, but also to stop this so that actually there are jobs in future. We used to be proud of our maritime industries in this country. Now this is a source of shame. It has to be stopped.
Right, and we are looking ahead to sort of look at proposals that might stop it happening again. But Chris, what do you make of the argument, the difference between Labour and the government and the unions on this in terms of the workers themselves, the 800?
Well, the hope is they can get some way back into the company. But I mean, it does feel, doesn't it, that it is busy after the event, I think. What can the government do? I mean, it can say this is outrageous. I mean, people can take a view on P&O, whether to...
They can also clarify when they knew about this, because the challenge with all of this is increasingly P&O are telling us that they knew...
say.
Well, except P&O are saying they knew much earlier that there were going to be more redundancies and they weren't consulting on them. Well, that's the thing that needs to be bottomed out here, because I was in the statement with Grant Shapps where he said they weren't, and we all listened to what he had to say and said, well, I had this memo, I didn't think they were going to do it like that. No Transport Minister should be casual about any form of redundancy at this point in time in an industry that's been hit by COVID. So we need a much more active policy. But we also need to stop fire and rehire.
I don't know why EU law isn't covered here either. I mean, these ships are plying between the European Union mainly and Britain. I mean, there must be some... We have basically the same law as the European Union only a few years after Brexit. The ships are flagged elsewhere, aren't they? And whether that governs the employment conditions. But if they're only ever landing in EU or UK ports, why can't that affect?
Well, I think Boris Johnson referred to it as the UK economic zone. I wasn't exactly sure what that counted as. Let's return to Ukraine. You heard in the headlines President Zelensky. It's a month since Russia launched its invasion of Ukraine. President Volodymyr Zelensky recorded his latest video message from the streets of Kiev. He's done it many times, but this time in English. It was a pretty powerful message as he appealed to the world for help. Let's have a listen.
Come from your offices, your homes, your schools and universities. Come in the name of peace. Come with Ukrainian symbols to support Ukraine, to support freedom, to support life. Come to your squares, your streets, make yourselves visible and heard. Say that people matter, freedom matters, peace matters, Ukraine matters.
Ed, will you be taking to the streets encouraging people to go out and protest?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an incredibly powerful message, and we all obviously support Ukraine, and absolutely we need to carry on doing more, and this needs to continue to be at the top of our headlines.
Through, though? I mean, that is a very personal appeal for people to be visible, as he says,
yeah, I think
President.
I think people are passionate. You know, you only have to look at what people are doing in terms of supporting refugees and moving forward, offering their homes, offering schools, offering support.
I suppose
people want to help. People want to feel
they
can
do.
Make a difference.
I suppose the issue is will it make any difference? I mean, first of all, do you echo what President Zelensky has said? Will you be encouraging people to actually take to the streets? Yes, I can see you.
Well, I have my Ukrainian ribbons with me, and Sadiq Khan has organised a rally this Saturday, I believe, in central London for Ukraine. I'm sure we have. My local community, people are already organising, working out how they can support refugees. Look, I think the message it's sending is, you know, a month on, do not let this slip off the agenda. Well, we all said this is probably going to be a long war of attrition. What matters here now is what are we doing to maximise pressure, and there's still much more we can do on the economic sanctions. We need more legislation to come forward because we need to keep ratcheting up the pressure. So we can wear ribbons, we can protest, but also as politicians, we have to act, and that's a cross-party call. And I'm sure, Ed, in the House of Lords, you'll be joining us in seeking tougher sanctions.
Well, I want to hear from the other panelists.
Well, I know we'll give them time to think about the economic sanctions. But Chris, is Stella right on that important point that is it slipping down? Is it going to slip down news agendas because it's turning into a war of attrition as it looks?
I think today is the first day in a month we haven't seen it on our front pages in the same way. I mean, given us such an enormous day, I mean, Spring Statement is obviously a big day. But I think the journalism, the brave Telegraph reporters, BBC reporters, Guardian, all colleagues across the board who we know in the industry are raising it up, showing what's going on. I was talking to a Ukrainian refugee for my podcast this morning. She thinks that the coverage that we are showing on nightly news is accurate, is what's going on. Keep doing it. I think it matters to us so much. I think that appeal there, in a second or third language, to be that passionate about it, to sound so passionate about it, is deeply moving, isn't it?
And he is very brave, of course, as so many people have said. But Miata, in terms of the difference it might make, people actually protesting. People have protested in capital cities around the world, but will it actually persuade Vladimir Putin or put enough pressure to actually bring this to a close?
I don't think it will persuade Putin, but I think it can do two things. I think it shows a degree of solidarity, which for the people in Ukraine, I think will give them a sense of kind of hope when they are in desperate situations. I think it will apply pressure on our politicians that we expect you to continue doing more. Don't expect this to go off our agenda so that, the more that you can do on economic sanctions or aid and support, you suddenly don't do. But I hope some of it filters through to the Russian people, because I think there is still...
and they've been protesting. Russian...
And that's increasing. But, I mean, there's huge degrees of disinformation. The narrative and story that they are hearing, the routes by which information is getting through to the population is very, very limited. I think, protests on a global scale might start to paint a picture that just counters.
Yes.
And then that creates a bit of domestic pressure, which, again, I'm not sure how much impact it will have on Putin, but it might start to change the dynamics with the people around him.
All right, well, we've talked about people perhaps coming out on the street, showing solidarity in the way you've all said. NATO leaders have gathered for an emergency summit in Brussels to discuss further support for Ukraine. There is the traditional family photo of them all there. They're agreeing to increase forces in countries around Ukraine in Eastern Europe, and there is more military support. What else can be done? I mean, we'll come on to Stella's point about tougher economic sanctions, but more broadly, what else can NATO do in the absence of a no-fly zone, which seems to be holding?
Well, I mean, the Russian government is a pariah government now, so we should continue to cut off all economic ties where we can. It is unclear, there is a lot of criticism, perhaps, of Germany and other countries in Europe in terms of continuing to trade with Russia. There are some companies that are still trading in Russia, so we need to keep on those. We're continuing to send arms and financial support to Ukraine, and that needs to continue and increase. We need to continue the process of effectively rearming NATO and securing our NATO borders as well. We need to be able to take refugees. The point about Zelensky's statement is that this is obviously a physical war, a terrible war of violence and attrition, but it's also an information war. It's a propaganda war, if you like, so we need to continue to win hearts and minds. It's interesting, in the West, you know, we're all Ukrainians, we all support Ukraine. Actually, the mood in different parts of the world is different because the propaganda against Ukraine is more effective in other countries.
Briefly, Stella?
I don't disagree with anything that Ed has said there, and I think one of the things we also have to be very alive to is the amount of disinformation on local groups, and in this country as well. We are being targeted for it, and I would say to people, don't go and protest, but also speak up and make sure you're challenging, because this is an international war of attrition.
All right. Thank you to all of my guests. Thank you to the Thursday panel and Chris Hope. And I will be back tomorrow with Politics UK. From all of us, bye-bye.